Yeah, I didn't get on the phone this week like I should have.
He may have called, and I left my phone at the house this morning. And so I told Mary, I said, I don't really need it. I probably won't have anybody calling me. And then I told her halfway to the church, I said, I'll get home and have 30-something calls, 30-something missed calls, But anyway, this morning, excuse me, we're in 2 Samuel chapter 9. It's a really short chapter, but some very, very good information here on David's kind heart towards the house of Saul. And I wanted you guys to I hope that you guys dug in your Bible a little bit this past week and was able to get a chance to read it. There's a few challenging words in there, but we're going to push through. Here we go. On David's kindness to Mephibosheth. Okay, I may say that right the first time and then get it wrong all the rest of the time. But anyway, chapter 9, 2 Samuel chapter 9. Verse 1, it says, Now David said, Is there still anyone who is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Zeba. So when they had called him to David, the king said to him, Are you Zeba? He said, At your service. Then the king said, Is there not still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? And Zeba said to the king, There is still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet. So the king said to him, Where is he? And Zeba said to the king, Indeed, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lo-debar. Then King David sent and brought him out of the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lo-debar. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. Then David said, Mephibosheth. And he said, Here is your servant. So David said to him, Do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. Then he bowed himself and said, What is your servant, that you should look upon such a dead dog as I? And the king called Zeba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul, and to all his house. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always. Now Zeba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Zeba said to the king, According to all that my lord the king has commanded his servant, so will your servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, You shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who dwelt in the house of Zeba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both his feet. Okay. Like I said, a very short chapter. A very, very short chapter. But, excuse me. So what do we see happening here at this point in time in the middle of David's, I don't know, it's kind of like his flowering point of his life, of his life as king there in Israel. So what do we see happening at this point in time? Anybody?
Well, he's still honoring that Saul was God's appointed in his friendship with Jonathan.
Right, okay. Notice right there in verse 1 where it says, Now David said, Is there still anyone who is left of the house of Saul? Why would he ask such a question? Does anybody know?
Because Saul and all his sons had been killed.
Well, that, and also during that time frame, from like at the end of one dynasty, one family's dynasty, and it got turned over to another family's dynasty, they would not usually leave any one of the old dynasty alive. They would kill them all off. And why would they do that?
So there wouldn't be any competition.
So when we need a competition, or they might not make an uprising or come to try to steal the throne again, back to their family. But here we see something different happening, don't we? We see that David is not asking this question for that reason. We see David asking that question for what? Anybody? Notice right there where it says that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake. Right? So we see that back in 1 Samuel when Jonathan and David were really close, weren't they? And what they do before David went on the run, Jonathan and David did what with each other? They made a pact. Remember that pact?
Exactly right.
They made a pact with each other. And Saul, and even though Saul was chasing David, Jonathan pulled off his robe, right? And he gave it to, in his armor, and he gave it to David to try on and stuff, and because he was telling David, you will be the next king. Even though he knew he was in line for the king, to become king, he did give this stuff to David and told David that he knew he would become next king, right? But they made a pact that he said that, Jonathan said that if and when he did become king, that what, he asked him what he would do. What would he do?
Excuse me.
That he would spare any one of his lineage, right? In other words, he wouldn't kill them like most other new kings would do. You know what I'm saying? So it says, 1 Samuel chapter 7, David asked, what can I do for God? And he proposed to build a temple for the Lord. Now David asked another question that we should ask. What can I do for others? It says David's question showed a great love because Saul made himself an enemy of David. It was customary in those days for the king of new dynasty to completely massacre anyone connected with the prior dynasty. David went against the principle of revenge and against the principle of self-preservation and asked what he could do for the family of his enemy. Okay, you notice back in this time, in today's, even in today's society, they have rules and regulations set forth. You know, it's kind of like when one president leaves and the other one comes in. Most of those people that were on the administration, the staff, they get canned, don't they? Yeah, absolutely. So. Notice he said that I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake. David did this because he remembered his relationship and covenant with Jonathan. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 14 and 15 states this. It says, and you shall, and you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. This was that pact that Jonathan and David made together, that the one last time prior to David going on the run and Saul being at his heels each and every day. So we know that they had such a relationship that David is remembering back and he's honoring that covenant that he made with his father, Jonathan. It says his actions were not only based on feelings, but also on the promise of the covenant that he made with Jonathan. Okay, you guys see that? It says, now Zeba, David could only learn that there was a descendant of Saul still living and could only learn where he was through his servant named Zeba. this meant that Mephibosheth was in hiding. Okay? So why do you think Mephibosheth was in hiding?
So that he wouldn't be killed. And he couldn't really defend himself
because he was lame in his feet. He was a cripple, right? Mm-hmm. And he knew that he couldn't get away. So he was in hiding, fearing that David would take him out because of the way customs were back then. Okay? It says the kindness of God. Notice that we see here in verse 3 where it says, now the king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? If we notice here, he's not saying show the kindness of man, because the kindness of man is different than the kindness of God. Absolutely right?
That's right.
Absolutely right. Because the way I see it is that man, we usually put a stipulation on it, don't we? Well, I'll forgive you, but you see, I'll forgive you, but you have to promise me you'll never do it again. Guess what? God's not that way, and not that way. You know, he'll forgive us, and then he forgets about it. You know, but here we see that David is saying, is there anyone not left in the family of Saul that I might show the kindness of God to them? You know, so that is David speaking from the heart. That's something that he's bringing from his heart, right? Yeah. It's just not words that he's saying so they can get Mephibosheth to come out of hiding. You see? So it says, this phrase is key to understanding David's motivation in this chapter. David wanted to show someone else the same kindness that what? That God showed him.
That's right.
Remember the many times that David was, he's in a bad spot because of Saul, but God showed him kindness and worked through it and hid him and showed him places to go and things to do. Notice he says, there is still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet. Does anybody know how he became lame in his feet? I think it was in 1 Samuel that we learned that he was lame in his feet, right? So, does anybody recall that besides Brother Rick?
That part.
Was he born that way?
No, he wasn't born that way. When he was 5 years old, I'll give you a hint. When he was 5 years old, go ahead, Julia. I think I just got
No, I can't remember, but
I can't hear.
All right, so 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4, I think it is. Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son who was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And it happened, as she made haste to flee, that he fell and became lame. His name was Mephibosheth. So his nurse found out what was going on between Saul and Jonathan, and she was afraid, and so she grabbed up Mephibosheth to go and flee to safety. And for some reason, she tripped and fell, and when she did, Mephibosheth's legs or feet became crippled. I don't know if she just broke them or what happened, but Kate became crippled, and therefore he couldn't walk. Okay, so. It says, we should remember why Mephibosheth's nurse gathered the boy and fled in haste at the news of Saul and Jonathan's death. She rightly feared that the leader of a new royal dynasty would execute every potential heir of the former dynasty. Okay, so she did this, taking Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, to safety she thought she was doing a good thing, and then something bad turned of it. But actually, she got him out alive, and he was able to go into hiding. Okay, it says the son of Jonathan. This means that according to the prior dynasty of Saul, Mephibosheth had the right to the throne. He was a son of the firstborn son of the king, and other potential heirs were dead. In a political sense, David could see Mephibosheth as a rival or a threat. And so when David asked this question, that we see in the first chapter. Now David said, is there still anyone who is left in the house of Saul? That's a question that every king asks. So David was just doing what kings do. Hey, is there anybody left? You know? But he was asking for a different reason. Most kings would ask, hey, is there anybody left so that I might kill them? And there will be no harm coming to my dynasty. But instead, we see that David was asking for a whole different reason, so that he might show kindness that the type of kindness of God instead of mankind. So it says, Ishbosheth was Mephibosheth's uncle, and he waged a bloody war against David for the throne of Israel. There was at least an outside chance that Mephibosheth might do the same. And so David, in his mind could have been thinking totally different, but he wasn't. Why wasn't he thinking differently? Why wasn't he thinking like most kings?
Because the Lord was working on it.
Because God was working within him, right? Absolutely, Terry. Absolutely. Good job.
That's right.
So, it says David's kindness to Mephibosheth. Okay, we see here that the king David sent and brought him out of the house of Machir, the son of Amiel from Lo-debar. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. Then David said, Mephibosheth, and he answered, here is your servant. Okay, so it says Mephibosheth must have been terrified when messengers from David knocked on his door and demanded that he come with them to see the king. In the back of his mind, he anticipated the day when David would do as other kings did and massacre other potential rivals on the throne. So what do you think was going through his mind whenever the servants knocked on his door? Absolutely just that, right?
That he was injured.
Today is my last day. Probably should have had all my stuff in order, right? But David removes all those fears from Mephibosheth, doesn't he?
Yep.
What does he end up doing? Come on, guys! I just read the chapter to you.
Gave back all his land. Yeah. I was trying to.
Right. He gave back all. He restored there was the That's what it was. There's the restored. That's the one you were looking for.
They gave him a seat at his table.
He restored all of Saul's authority and land, right?
And they gave him a seat at the table, the king's table, where he would be able to eat bread all his days.
Good deal. Well, there you go. So it says, I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan's and father's sake. David made a covenant with Jonathan in 1 Samuel chapter 20, promising to show kindness to his descendants of Jonathan. And David gladly made good on the promise through Jonathan, though Jonathan was dead. Remember, in the covenant that he made with Jonathan, he said, even in now as you live and when, after your death, I will show kindness to your descendants. And here he's making good on that promise, isn't he? So we see there that he says, that he said that your servant, here is your servant. So we see that Mephibosheth is fallen and showing, customary respect to David, even though, he was from a family that, he was in line for the throne before, but he's still showing respect to David. And because
I
of.
know he was a little nervous from the previous king.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
You talked about.
absolutely. Knowing that David had done so much prior to becoming king, you know.
So I mean, the other kings, how they would kill the other lineage.
Right,
And here he is coming to him.
right.
But the cynical person would say that, well, he gave him a seat at his table so that he keep his eye on him and make sure that he's not going to rebel.
Rebel against him, right? Yeah, that's true. This is true.
And it would be true because he was not as generous to some of
His other
Saul's other
enemies, absolutely.
kinfolk.
No, he wasn't. So we also see, I know we got about 5 more minutes, but we also see that that King David gives instructions to Zeba too, right? Zeba being a servant of the prior dynasty as well. But David's given Zeba some instructions on what he shall do until Mephibosheth dies, right? So he says, and the king called Zeba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and to all his house. You therefore and your sons and your servants, right, shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always. Now Zeba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Zeba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king has commanded his servant, so will your servant do. So Zeba falls in line as well, right? Okay, good. So it says here, David fulfills his promise to Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both his feet. So Mephibosheth no longer had to be in hiding, did he?
That's right.
No, he didn't have to fear, death upon himself, as it would have been if any other king had taken the throne. Says, no longer hiding in fear of the king, this descendant of Saul now lived openly among the people of God. He also ate continually at the king's table. He was no longer in poverty and estranged from the king. Now he had great privilege before the king. So, and David had restored all that stuff. So, but he said he was lame in his feet. Weakness did not vanish. His life was far better, but he was still lame. David's grace to Mephibosheth is a wonderful picture of God's grace to us. We are Mephibosheths, if you think about it. God's grace is upon us every day. So, is there any questions? Anybody got any questions? We're fixing to have to break loose and head into our worship. Okay, no questions? If we don't have any questions at this time, Luis, will you close us in prayer? No? All right. All right.
I remember that first time I was calling.
Brother Frank, will you close us in prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, we do thank you once again for this day and many blessings, Lord. We
Yes, Lord.
thank you for this message that's been brought, and ask that you would go with us into the song service and the preaching afterwards, Lord. Keep us safe as we go our separate ways and bring us back at the point of our. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.